much to hear your views, your experiences from your own work to support the work of our team. Now, who are we? We are a team here of the World Bank and the United Nations. And I myself, since I have the power of the microphone, I'll introduce myself first. My name is Christiana Stepanek-Allen. I work for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. That's a UN-based organization in Geneva. The only thing we are not is a conference, so that's a very old title. What we do, we are the focal point and the expertise in the UN system on all matters relating to foreign direct investment, the activities of multinational corporations. And what we do is our clientele are governments, predominantly. We're helping governments to attract foreign investment, to formulate good policies to attract it, to benefit from that multinational investment, and to minimize the risk. So we are helping governments writing their investment regimes, investment laws. We work with Investment Promotion Agency, helping them to attract investment. We do investment facilitation in different areas and different sectors. We have the largest database on activities of multinationals, which we publish every year in something called the World Investment Report. Every year there is a theme, and in 2009 our theme was on investing in agriculture, which came very timely, the food crisis, and this is the time when we began teaming up with the World Bank, because we were looking at the information data available on investment in agriculture, and we found there was very little field-based evidence on the movements of agricultural investments, the impact of agricultural investment. And this is when we started together with the World Bank, our colleagues here, to look at evidence-based research to be able to give better advice to governments working with the private sector to have responsible agricultural investment promoted. Now, we have here with us the World Bank, and we'll introduce them in a moment. This is Christopher Brett, who is the lead agricultural specialist in the World Bank, together with Asuka Okamura, who is the project manager for our big program and the driver behind everything you see here in terms of the organization and also the expertise. And then we have Duncan Pringle, who is our World Bank colleague. He is based out of South Africa, and he's been leading our research for the last, since probably 2012, field-based research in Africa on this program. What is it we're trying to do here today? What we would like to know is we've built up over the last 5, 6, 7 years a lot of evidence-based research on issues pertaining to agricultural investment. And now we have a large amount of literature. We have created knowledge, and these are these knowledge notes you've seen, and Krista will introduce them to you. These notes, we have put them together, and what we'd like to do with you today is field test them to see if what our assumptions, our findings hold true with you who are on the ground, where the rubber hits the road, as my boss always used to say. And so we want a frank discussion with you. Thank you for spending your time in helping us improve on our work and see how that could also be useful to you. How are we going to do that? Very briefly, we have a very charged day because we know we can't take more than a day out of your time. So we will have first presentation, introduction by Chris, and then a keynote presentation example by Olam. Then, as you've seen, you've been asked to divide yourselves up or show interest in sub-themes, which we'll be discussing later on. Some of you have given preferences. If not, we will preference you in one of those rooms so that we have sort of equal numbers. So we will have breakout rooms in the morning session. One is the environmental social impact assessment, so that you will remember that they signed up for that, or for screening prospective investors. So you will either go with Duncan and myself to room 1, or you will stay here with Chris and Asuka in room 2. And we'd like to really talk through with you what have been our findings, what have been your experiences, so we can take them forward. And those ones who are not in the respective other rooms, we will do a summary of each debate at the end of the day. So you will be hearing the findings from our respective discussions afterwards. So you're not missing out if you've chosen only one or the other topic. We will have a very brief break so that we can divide up the rooms, and then from 10:30 to 12 o'clock we'll are in the working groups. We will have lunch here 12 to 1. The lunch will be served downstairs, and we have the ladies outside who will help us, guide us for that 1 hour lunch break. We'd like to have a group photograph with you as well, for our sakes, and maybe some of you are also interested. The second, in the afternoon, we will have a second case study presentation, which Duncan will be leading, and then we break up again in the 2 rooms. Designing mutually beneficial outgrowth schemes or inclusive business models. Again, after that, you have coffee, we write up our notes, and then we'll come back with you, and we have a good hour to talk about some of these findings. You may have comments on the other groups, but we want this to be as useful for you as can be as well. Is there anything that you can be taking back with you? And for us, of course, we will then see how we continue our work. As I told you, we have about 20 notes at the moment on specific sub-themes, and Chris will show them to you right now. So our work will continue, but we'd like to engage whoever on you is interested to keep you as a partner as well when we have other notes or other findings, that we can bounce them off with you, so we're staying in the working relationship, because very unlikely that we're going to get back together in this group, but it's such a powerful group of knowledge, and we would like to keep you aligned to our program as much and as long as we can. So with this, I think without further ado, it's going to be a very tense day. I hope you manage to take something away as well. And I hand over to Chris. And then I'll speak to you again at the end of the day.
Is it spoken? Okay, thank you very much. And I also a very, very warm welcome to all of you. And thank you so much for your time. So as I said, I'm Chris Brett with the World Bank. I've got this fantastic title of Lead Agribusiness Specialist. In the World Bank, we all have to have titles so we know where we fit. I have to be very, very honest with you and say I only joined the World Bank in November last year. So I'm new to understanding all the structures of the World Bank. But before that, I'd worked in a multinational company, which I'll come clean with and say was Olam, before I joined the World Bank. And so I gained fantastic on-the-ground experience, which my ex-colleague Ramesh will talk about as a case study. And I got involved in the last 10 years on a lot of working, not with just smallholder agriculture, but very much into this large-scale agricultural space. And you know, it's a subject which is very, very close to me now. I mean, having the opportunity to come into the bank and actually work and push this agenda forward, I think is really, really important. I'll explain that more in this presentation I'm going to give to you as well. But just as a very, very quick headline, the World Bank Group. What does that mean? When I joined them, I didn't ask some silly questions like how many people are in the bank. And if I asked anyone around here, how many people are based in the Washington, D.C. head office for the World Bank, I wonder if anyone's got any clue the number of people. Any quick ideas? 1,500? 5,000? Well, I was shocked. I went to the first HR briefing, and it was 9,150 people based in Washington, and 6,000 people based in all over the other parts of the world. So we are 15,000 people, and I'm very proud to say very, very good quality people, very, very people who are really out there in the forefront of what we do. But I think what's interesting is to sort of break down the World Bank, what it does, because a lot of you realize we invest in infrastructure, we invest in health, we invest in all sorts of areas to do with governance and so on, but talking about agriculture, where I sit in the global agricultural practice, and I'm in what we call the Global Engagements Unit, so which means I work across all of the agricultural global programs that the bank's involved in. And to be very, very clear, the bank is the largest actual investor in agriculture when it comes from the donor or the support side. And a lot of that money is actually, you know, our investments in terms of soft loans to governments, and a lot of it is also advisory work to the government. So when we look at the World Bank Group, and I'm especially like the word group, the side I work on works, and our clients are governments. And the reason why we've called all of you guys here today, and I'm using the word guys meaning plural for women as well, and I'm quite sad to say, look around us, we're still a very male-dominated society when it comes to agriculture, as Ramesh is always aware at Olam. So, so obviously we will be talking about gender inclusion today as well, so thank you for coming, ladies. But when we talk about the way the bank works, we also think of IFC, the International Finance Corporation, and it's important to acknowledge them because the IFC is the investor within the private sector. So I'm working with the government, and as I said, inviting you guys here today is a really important aspect because we are like brokers in some ways. We're trying to invest in the public good to ensure that the private good can flourish. And that is a really tough area to be in, really tough. And you say, why? We mustn't be investing in supporting and subsidizing the private sector. We need to be enabling the private sector through the government. But a lot of our work now has moved into really looking at agricultural value chains. And I'm excited about the agenda because we got the RIE work, Responsible Agricultural Investment, but we also have this huge amount of work of how do we link production more to markets. There's a huge growth in urban markets, huge opportunities that a lot of businesses haven't seen yet. And we are now trying to work on how we link those value chains. So there's a lot of investments coming up in agricultural parks, business hubs, agricultural processing hubs, special economic zones, which the bank has been giving a lot of support, but also trying to work out really how we can support much more smallholder development to link to large-scale agricultural production or large-scale agricultural processing. So looking at this agenda, you know, why is it important for us as a bank and as a public good and responding to a lot of the issues which are being discussed in the G20 or the G8 as well, is the fact that we all are looking for food and nutrition security. And we have to be honest, we can't be reliant on small-scale agricultural production to meet economically, commercially, viably, however you want to put it, the needs of the market. So it's a blend. We've got to strengthen the smallholders. There's a lot of value in what the smallholders do. But we've also got to ensure that we're increasing productivity across all of these nations. And what I'm really pleased is that we look at the portfolios of all of you here in the room today. You have a considerable outreach in how you are influencing productivity, how you're influencing quality, how you're starting to bring a lot of product into the marketplace. The other thing is that governments are fixated about is jobs. And large-scale agriculture is seen, and large-scale agricultural investment in terms of processing and so on, is seen as creating huge economic opportunity for those countries. So it is an agenda where governments are really, really focused on. We're doing some work in India at the moment, and when I look at headline numbers, you know, I'm surprised to read that 1 million qualified Indians come into the job market every month. You know, that's a huge statistic. And we see a lot of these issues coming up in obviously a lot of the context of Africa, where we are getting educated people who are trying to find those jobs. Now, we've also aren't going to hide the fact today that agriculture is not considered by a lot of the youth a good profession. How do we change agriculture? How do we make it more commercial, more engaged? How do we involve technology? How do we make it much more interesting for this youth to engage in agriculture? I was in Côte d'Ivoire recently, and I was out in some cocoa areas, and you speak to the cocoa cooperatives, and you speak to a farmer, and you say, you know, what do you think of the future of, you know, your agricultural scene, how it's going, you know, are your children getting educated? Guy said to me very bluntly, I'm educating my children so they're not farmers. And when I tried to encourage him about all the positive side of agriculture, he wouldn't hear it at all. So we are going through a lot of issues where we've got to look at the commercialization of agriculture. So creating jobs, really important. Obviously for us, I mean, I'm very much taken by the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. This has been negotiated, not just at government level, but very inclusive with business. And business now are realizing and really rising up to the challenge that where you are investing, it's not just about the economic opportunity and the returns you bring to your shareholders or your businesses, it's also about the development impacts you bring. And why is that important? Because it will bring stability to those operations in the long term. We have to have positive development. We've got to create more development within the rural or the rural provinces areas, outside of the cities, outside of the secondary cities, and so on. So this is an important area for us, and we are seeing a huge amount of alignment of business in how they're working with us. And just to put a caveat in there is that the World Bank works in a big area under what we call IDA, International Development Assistance, and towards the end of last year, there was a fundraising replenishment of the World Bank. The World Bank is dependent on its donors to strengthen and invest in the bank. We have shareholders in the bank. So the IDA replacement came to $75 billion by agreement of December last year. And IDA 18 started on the 1st of July, so we're only a few days old into IDA 18. Why is it important in this room is to disclose that IDA 18 has a private sector development window for what we call IDA countries. And IDA countries, a lot of African countries are falling into that space, as well as obviously certain fragile states, certain states in Asia as well. And when we look at that, there's an allocation of $2.5 billion over the next 5 years, over the next 3 years, of that money to be approached for with the private sector. And that brings the word partnership in. Public-private partnerships. How the bank can facilitate government and fund the government-public part to link with the private sector for viable commercial, economic, environmental, good quality agricultural programs. We can all around this room agree that the agricultural extension programs of national governments has really declined, and there's a real split between cash crop, food crop. Food crops are not very well supported in many of the countries that we operate in, whereas cash crops like coffee, like cotton, like cocoa, and so on, those kind of niche products do get support because the private sector has a direct interest in that commodity. So we're trying to look at how we can develop and progress those areas. So what I'm trying to say to you is that this is all about responsible agricultural investment. It's not just about investing to make a buck. It's talking about how we can support this whole process, because I know from experience that you're at huge risk if you put your money into an investment which has not been correctly assessed from the environment and social point of view, how you mitigate those risks. One of our studies showed that 45% of agricultural investment in Africa fails. And if you said predominantly why, it was because of social conflict. That was the predominant reason, but I'll talk about some more of the reasons going forward. So we want to improve the business environment, and that's why we need feedback today on how we're going through our areas. So the first thing to say is that we've been working on the word principles. Well, what are the principles and what do the principles mean? So therefore, looking around this, we've set up what this is called CFS-RAI, Committee of Food Security, Responsible Agricultural Investment. RAI, Responsible Agricultural Investment, started off as this World Bank UNCTAD relationship. And after 2 to 3 years, we started working with the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and other government organizations, which came up with these 10 principles to be followed and to be supported through agricultural investments. They're broad statements, but every statement has a meaning. I mean, if you just look at one of these ones here, when we look at respect tenure and land, fisheries, forests, and access to water, these are very, very important issues, not just for a business, but for the government and for the communities that we operate in. So a lot of these principles are being adopted by businesses, but I'm sure when you look into these subjects, you'll see a huge range of standards or ideas on how your investments should be going forward. What we're trying to do is to support the governments in taking on these principles that will be worked upon with investors. So with all this research that you've been hearing about, I just want to sort of stress to you that there's been numerous stakeholder research, beautiful words, that the bank has done. I mean, Duncan's led a lot of this work with teams on the ground going and talking to mature investments and new investments. And what was really interesting is the majority of investments are considered to be positive, the majority. But then there are areas where people express their concern. And the biggest negative concern, of course, is land. Land is, obviously we expect that to be the issue. So how we manage that land access and how we work on that is really important. The other side, of course, is the expectation of the government, you can see there are very high, is about employment. The expectation of the government when an investor comes in is how many jobs will you create? How many permanent jobs will you create? How many seasonal jobs will you create? How many temporary jobs will you create? There's a lot of issues here in this worker labour space. And we are, in agriculture, we work, quite frankly, in a lot of the bottom end of the employment. Tough jobs, difficult jobs, and in some cases, not really rewarding jobs. You know, jobs that are important and jobs that we look at, how can we upskill? How can we get those jobs to create a better income for that worker? You know, we all know that we're under a lot of pressure now on labor rights. There is a huge debate on the minimum wage. There's a huge debate on the fair wage. What is a fair wage? What is a living wage? What is the gap? So there's a lot of research going on which shows that in several countries like Tanzania, for example, if you look at the minimum wage of an agricultural worker to what is assessed as the living wage being that basket that you should be able to provide for your family, you should be able to pay your school fees and so on, the gap is about 35%. So tomorrow, if the government turned around and put the minimum wage up 35% to go so-called to the living wage, then you can imagine how disruptive that would be to a business or a supply chain. So these are the kind of areas we're looking at. Obviously here we're looking at the food security, we're looking at the education, we're looking at outgrower programs, all the things that those benefits can bring. The other large area that communities like about these investments is the infrastructure that they bring, the opening up of those communities, the access they bring to what the communities can achieve as well. So here, just to really sort of like come to an end of this, and when I finish talking, we're going to do a very quick round around the table so we know who we all are, and then Ramesh will give us a case study on Olam. So just here, what next? I mean, we've done all of this research, and I don't want you to look at me and our others and the colleagues behind me are in Washington, in Tanzania, and everywhere. We're not a bunch of academics who are disconnected from the real life. You know, let's put that bluntly on the table. I mean, I'm an operational kind of person. I know how much it costs to do investments here and investments there, and also what the expectation are, hopefully, of all parties. I can assure you that over the last few months, I've been in Cote d'Ivoire, I've been in Rwanda, I've been in Ethiopia, we've been here. There's a lot of discussions going on in Washington with meetings, a lot of meetings with ministers from governments. Those ministers and governments are really tightening up their expectation of investment. It's not just about bring the investor in and then not think about it. It's really bring the investor in, the good investor, who's got a good business plan, who's going to work in that government, to the government's national objectives as well. And those national objectives aren't hard from the point of view, it's about employment, it's about economic development. It's all about what your business should be bringing anyway. So my work now, I've said in the bank, I don't want to do any more research. I want to apply the research, take it into action, take it forward so that everybody now is joining us. We're working with government on workshops. We did a workshop in Senegal, we did a workshop in Ghana recently, we've done workshops in other areas. We've got more coming up before the end of this year. And it is all about communicating with the government and the private sector locally, but also bringing civil society and NGO into those discussions and looking at these areas. Now, what are the areas? We have 20 areas. Now, we're calling them knowledge nodes. And I'll be very, very frank with you, because I want an open day today, is that we can write endless reports on large-scale agricultural investment. But there's always that concern of how contentious you can be in your reports. You know, if you really put your cards on the table and you really said the issues on land, the issues on community conflict, and if you talked a lot about failure, you could put a lot of people off agriculture. Agriculture is a risky investment scenario. So it's a question how we can strengthen that business case. So we're looking at these knowledge nodes to actually inform, work with government, work with private sector, work with the NGO, civil society, to an academic community, to bring these very crisp documents together on the issues that we think are really important to business. Now, we've sent out 4, which we're going to discuss today, and we appreciate that we would like to split you into groups to discuss this. It's a bit like an airline when they come round and say, you know, your first choice is this and your second choice that's, sorry, your first choice is not available anymore. But we'll do our best to make sure that we fit you all in. But you'll all be part of the process of learning today. So we're looking at these 4 on designing mutually beneficial outgrower schemes, the screening of prospective investors, the ESIA process, environmental social impact, and inclusive business models. But you can see all the others that are in process that will be completed before the end of this year. We are going through a process where we develop these based on our research experience. We review them within the bank. We externally review them with a community of specialist leaders we have. And then we are taking input from other stakeholders. So if any of you from today want to continue us on this journey, we can put you on distribution lists so you can see what we're coming on. I mean, none of these areas are rocket science, but they're all important to come together for that business. Okay, and a welcome to you all. And we will be having another few people who are drifting in. They're coming a bit late. We are really honored with the actual people and the quality that have come to this meeting. And I'm hoping that in the breaks you'll have time to network and discuss together as well. So I'd like to invite Ramesh, who's going to talk about the Olam experiences for about half an hour or so. And then I'll do a Q&A with Ramesh. So any questions to me or Ramesh with the audience, with yourselves, will be really good. But please be open and be critical of us as well. You know, if you're not happy with the way the bank is going on some of our thoughts and process. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you the rest of the team for this opportunity. Good morning to all of you. I'll take you through briefly for about 5 minutes about what my organization does to give you a context of who we are and why I'm speaking to you just now. So we are a 26-year-old company. We are currently listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange. We have two major shareholders. Temasek, which all of you must know, is the largest sovereign fund of Asia, is one of our large shareholders. Mitsubishi, the large Japanese business house, is the other large major shareholder. Apart from that, we have around 70,000 full-time employees. Seasonally, we employ more people apart from that. About 4.5 million farmers is what we have an interface with. We have an interface with over 2 million farmers on a daily basis. We have $200 million at any point in time stuck with them. As most of you know that quality of financing and the quality of risk when you finance small-scale farmers, what that means. That is the kind of risk we take in our business. We believe we have the systems and the people and a pretty good understanding of the lay of the land to take that risk. We are in 25 countries in Africa, and importantly, we are not a trader. We operate over 200 processing facilities for the agricultural commodities around the world. We believe with 3.2 million hectares of land under our management, it might make us the world's largest corporate farmer. This is what we do in Africa, to give you a shorter snap of where we are placed on the continent. So we started in Nigeria 26 years ago, and we continue to believe that we have rare expertise in Africa. We have the courage to take some really delicate, fragile economies in Africa and manage businesses there. We have learned that the famous story of having to associate with governments is not necessary. We also realize that if you understand the priorities that the governments work with and work with them, it is possible to do business sensibly. The point to note here really is that 2.5 million farmers that I spoke about just now is where our crops come from. So we have no interest in owning land. We have different formats of working with land and farming across the continent. It depends on the landholding policies of the government. In many countries where land ownership for foreign companies like ours is possible, we are happy to own it. In many countries where the government wishes to give us concessions, we are happy to work with that format. In many countries, we work directly with the small-scale farmers, knowing that what they produce, they are looking for markets, they're looking for finance, they're looking for agricultural practices which are best in industry, and we are able to provide that. So I'll give an example of over 850,000 hectares of land in Mozambique that's been allocated to us as a concession in the north and northwest of Mozambique to grow cotton. So we have exclusive rights to grow cotton there. The problem in Mozambique, as most of you must be aware, is the lack of farmers. So what do you do to generate farming interest? You can't import farmers because in general, the population of the country is quite low. And as Chris mentioned, the interest for new generation to get involved with agriculture is really low. Everybody is looking to get educated and move on to a more regular salary-based work. We can't blame them. They've seen generations and generations of their parents struggling under the various pressures of not having finance, not having markets, not having knowledge, not having power, not having authority, being fully exploited. So there's really no reason for them to want to follow and do farming. So that's one different challenge. We'll come to that. On the 850,000 hectares of land under concession in Mozambique, we only operate 75,000 hectares because you can all imagine what 850,000 hectares looks like. In my last calculation, Benin and Togo put together is what approximately it works out to. So it's impossible to farm on all of that. So where we farm, what we have done is very simply focused on the quality of the yield that the cotton crop produces. You're all probably aware that the average cotton farmer in South Africa produces 3.5 tons for a hectare. The average cotton farmer across Africa produces 400 kilos. That's the kind of difference we are talking about on the same continent. So if we can move, and Mozambique is the worst yield history over the last 20 years. So Mozambique used to operate at about 180 kilos of cotton, raw cotton per ton, today, per hectare. Today, we have the farmers that work on the 75,000 hectares that we operate at approximately 400 kilos, which is still just the African average. We are far from anywhere near good profitable businesses. In the end, if the farmer is able to see that his work is generating greater yield and greater output, we think we can have a win and we can have continued interest. That's the first step. But we are 8 years into the operation and we are still there. Bottom line, we are in a long-term game. We are long-term partners and we invest for the long term. So we are okay with the idea that there will be cash flow issues for the first 7, 8, 9 years. And we work with that in mind. A quick look at what we do. We talked of selective upstream because of the 47 crops that we operate, we don't farm all of them. We farm just 21 of them. But that is selective, depends on the geography, depends on the crop conditions, depends on where we think is the best bang for our buck. This is the core of our business for a very long time, but we realize that life gets quite competitive in the supply chain business, and it's therefore important to expand our activities. And finally, some midstream processing. I spoke about the 200 plus processing centers, of which over 60 are in Africa alone. And this works quite nicely for us for two reasons. One is that we have extremely good relationships with our end users and buyers. And they are quite happy to allow us to take on some part of the processing burden rather than them having to run factories in some other parts of the world. So we run the factories and now deliver, for example, cocoa mass and cocoa butter instead of the cocoa bean to many of our customers. On the flip side, we are also capable of importing goods into Africa, processing them, packaging them, distributing them in Africa, because as you all know, Africa is about $40 billion short of raw agricultural commodity-based foods. So the opportunity for that exists as well. We coined this purpose on the basis of the interaction that we have with the communities, because long, long ago we realized that a win-win relationship with the community is really where we can ensure that our business is stable, secure, and on a long-term basis for the shareholders. So growing responsibly implies our communities have to get wealthy along with the business growth. And when that happens, there is a natural handshake and there is continuance. All of you know that most African farmers grow 2, 3, 4 crops at the same time, parallelly, sometimes on the same land. For us to be engaged on a continuous basis and be guaranteed of the crop being available next year as well, it's important for the farmer to see that what he produces has a market, the partner that he's working with is capable of and willing to finance him, and his agricultural practices improve so that his yield improves, and therefore he's seen to get wealthier. We realized long ago that digging toilets and building kitchens don't get us very far. Whatever we do for the community has to be self-sustaining, and the community has to see the value in making its own contribution. Only then can we have a long-term relationship. Therefore, our growing responsibly is a natural part of our model. Because of the nature of the communities we work with, poverty is I think one aspect that we naturally address. So in growing responsibly, like I just said, there are 3 real pillars, one of which is commercial, the other is environmental, and the last one is social. And each of them are an important part of our business plan. So water utilization, how land is ready for utilization over the next few years, how crop rotation needs to be done. All of that is things that we discuss with the farmers so that we can get better outputs for them and for us. Now I listen to lots of African leaders at the AU and outside, and in their various speeches in whatever language they speak, in the end we can distill their objectives for their country and therefore for Africa as a whole around these 4 themes. If we are able to address our business plans around these, we believe there is a partnership with the government possible. In the end, for the nature of business that we have, and most of you have, there are two real key partners. One is the community we work with, and the other is the governance. From the governance, all we are looking for is a fair playing field which is equal for all. If that exists, we are okay. Consistent policy comes our way, we are fine. We don't need anything more than that. With the communities, you need a partnership where we can both work together. And frankly, if we can get these two together, all these four can get addressed. As Chris spoke just now, agriculture has the capacity, at least in Africa, to be the largest source of employment. It also addresses the largest vote bank for the governance. So many governments react to that positively, saying, yes, you're working with my vote bank, go ahead, do something, show some results. Many governments are cagey about it, and I'll give you examples of how that works. With regards import substitution, easily, that marries quite nicely with food security, easily the largest bone of contention across Africa. And by producing food, by developing agriculture, one big pillar of their import substitution is taken care of. With regards upskilling, you can extend that from education, but we believe that as agriculture develops and processing gets more and more important, upskilling and therefore the capacity to employ people will become an important critical pillar. And if we are able to prove as a business that we are upskilling people and people are growing with us, it again I think appeals quite nicely to the communities and the governments both. A snapshot of where all we do some farming. This doesn't include any other concession work that we do. It's just pure plantation work. A snapshot of the investments we have across Africa. Obviously, you're not seeing the messy first 6 years or 7 years. This is the very nice, good-looking finished products. And these are closer home. So, like I said, 7 minutes. Okay. So these are the issues that Chris thought we should discuss. And I'll give you our point of view on this, and I'd be happy to take any questions or listen to your experiences as well. I just spoke about land management, where I said that we have no interest in the real estate play. We don't need to own the land. As long as we get a fair policy to operate the land in partnership with the community, we are okay with it. Most of our plantation work is around a core nucleus farm that we manage ourselves, and around that we have extension farmers who join the community. And the more that join us, the better it is. You all know that you can't run a processing center strictly on the basis on the strength of an extension farm, simply because outturns can change, weather risk will remain, how focused they will be on the crop that year is always uncertain. Therefore, the core nucleus farm is meant to supply to the processing center. And in the bargain, we think we are capable of then providing exposure to the extension farmers to have a look at what the best practices can be. So setting up model farms is one good way of doing that. In the end, if we are able to provide finance, able to provide good seed, able to provide inputs, and guarantee them the market to take back, we believe it's a formula that works with most communities. Again there, one doesn't need to own the land. I don't believe there is a Pan-African strategy for land management or for farming. In fact, there's no Pan-African strategy for the 25 countries that we do. Each country, each market, each region is different. The people that we deal with are different. Their priorities are different. And depending on how close to they are to the city, their mentality can change. So our approach to how we do plantations and farming and how much of interest we'll get from the communities is also dependent on that. So we have to alter our plans, and there is no blueprint for it is our view. So we provide the necessary freedom and scope of operation to our managers on the spot to be able to make those calls. Land will remain a sensitive area in our view, even though there is so much of land available in Africa. Most governments will talk about the fact that come and take land in my country and start doing farming, but the reality is slightly different. And some countries it's more different, in some countries it's less different. So we find that our experiences in Zambia have been extremely positive. Most of the time, what the government talks is what we see. We also realize that they are quite open to approaching private sector by telling them that, look, we don't have gold class policies. If you guys have good ideas where communities can win, country can win, and you can win, let's talk. We are quite happy to deal with governments like that because then there's an open dialogue. There are other countries where it's almost impossible to get land despite the fact that they have a very old, large, well-established farming culture. So we have a coffee farm in Tanzania, and getting an inch of land in Tanzania is a completely different challenge. And we have the proof of concept. We've had everybody from the government to come and have a look at our coffee farm and see what is possible and what we can do. We have taken them around the world to show them what all we do, where else, and how employment can be impacted, how upskilling can be impacted. But moving the paper to get a piece of land is an impossible job. So that's our experience across 2 countries which even share a border. And we have a coffee farm in Tanzania, we have a coffee farm in Zambia, and our experiences are very different. So that reiterates the point that there is no Pan-African strategy. In the end, as a farmer, if we don't have a long-term focus and we plan for cash flows in our industry, then we are not planning well. So the first time we saw a farm in Zambia for planting coffee, 7 years later is when you get the first bean. And that first bean is not cash. There's still 2 years still for cash to come, but at least bean is visible, some hope. So that's a 9-year period from the first time you see the land and start making a commitment to investment to the time you get the first dollar revenue. So most farming efforts in Africa have failed because cash flows have dried up, and then the farm goes to die. Because somebody didn't make a good plan, somebody didn't think about it, or somebody didn't consult somebody who knew something about it. So we made a million mistakes. But hopefully, we managed to come through all of this and still have some farming efforts on the continent because we think we have, now I think, have a good understanding of what does it take to really make a successful farm work. On Chris's request, I'll talk a bit about Ethiopia, and I'll be happy to hear your experiences around that. The first thing in defense of Ethiopia is that there is no doubt about the size and the quality of the opportunity. The second thing is that it is my considered view that unlike the rest of Africa, Ethiopia will grow differently. It will grow differently and it will grow positively. Number 3, it's a fantastic long-term bet. So those of you who have a few $1 million stashed away somewhere, wish to do farming, Ethiopia is a great country to go and do it. But first, you need to find a plot of land that the federal government and the state government and the regional government agree to give you. Then the 3 of them have to sign a paper that can take up to 24 to 48 months. And that depends on how lucky you are. So we've had one coffee farm in Ethiopia. We invested $4-5 million, not in buying the land, in getting the land ready for cultivation. And 4 years later, we still didn't get the paper. Now we are on a second coffee farm. It's now 24 months already, and we are still talking. But we are there for sure. We are going to invest there. We are going to have a coffee farm. That's for sure. Right? Will we throw $4-5 million again at it? No, not necessarily. But we are still talking. So you need that kind of patience. But you can't ignore 90 million people. You can't ignore 100 million people, high quality people, a country that's definitely going to, like I said, grow differently from the rest of Africa. You have to be there. It has the soil, it has the climatic conditions, it has the altitude, it has good quality skills, and it has a consuming market. Frankly, it's a bit difficult to beat that combination. So we have to figure out a way by which the government will be positively inclined towards foreign investments. You all know that in the last 20 years, they've already moved quite a distance. I went there first in 1994. We are in 2017. And a lot of the mindset has changed. So from 0, they are at 40. They still need to go 60 more. The second thing I'll say in their favor is that the rules are the same for everybody. That's a good thing in many ways. So you're all on the same ground. So we're all playing the same game. Many do not have the capacity or the stamina to last. Therefore, if you have it, that will be your differentiating factor. So I strongly recommend that look at Ethiopia positively, but be patient. We are still 7-10 years away from an easy playing field. It's nowhere near Zambia, for example. It's nowhere near Mozambique. Mozambique, the attitude is right, but the paperwork is wrong. We have a rice farm in the north of Mozambique, 10,000 hectares, leveled, planted, all that is fine. But we're not getting, after 2.5 years now, we still don't have a piece of paper to prove that we have control over that land for 25, 30 years. When you want to put in 30, 40, 50, $80 million, you need that kind of control. So the paperwork is taking its own time to sort itself out. Ethiopia is worse than that. That's our experience. We find that for farming assets, well, for farming, there is no financing in Africa available easily. You all know that. All the banks are making so much of money sitting in Johannesburg and Lagos and Nairobi, they don't want to go out anywhere else, right? So you need financiers like yourself to find money from somewhere else and take that financing risk. No financial institution takes that risk, okay? But if you have a finished farm and you bring it back to a large financial institution, and there are many, they are quite happy to buy it off your balance sheet and lease it back to you if you have a 2, 3, 4 year performance guarantee. Oh, ABSA is sitting right there. And I've had many conversations with your senior managers of how you guys are so profitable sitting here. So sale and lease back is an opportunity, I think, which African farmers should start looking at. Predominant in Australia, it's predominant in the US. I understand completely different economies. But banks are now wanting to talk. And this applies for processing assets as well. So if you have a tank farm or a oil refinery or a processing center for cocoa or coffee, it is possible. They'll look at it, they'll make an assessment, and they will take it off your balance sheet and give you back cash flow. So it's a possibility that anybody who does not have all the money for setting up an asset can consider. I spoke about our experiences in Zambia, Tanzania, Mozambique already. So thank you.
Pause there. A real strong thank you for that presentation. I did want to stress to you, we wanted to make this an operational focused discussion and a transparent discussion. I mean, to have Ramesh, who looks after this big part of Southeast Africa on all of the investments of Olam, and as part of the leadership team and the direction of the strategy of Olam, I think we can really appreciate that. He's come from Durban for the day for us. And you know, a lot of the experiences that Ramesh has talked about, I've been on that journey of patience with him the last few years, and so is our board, or the board of Olam. And it is incredible the discussions you can have and the enthusiasm in the country, but to transfer that enthusiasm into actionable business plans that work are really challenging. So what I wanted to say was just one little snippet on the research that we did. And I'm hoping Ramesh will agree with this, was that you know, this is an interesting comment. I'm not sure I should advocate it too strongly, but when you're the third buyer of an agricultural business, you have much more chance of success, which means that you've got to go through that journey of watching someone fail, then someone else buy it, watch them fail, then you pick it up. And what are you picking up as a third-time buyer? You could be picking up a large-scale land asset, which has had a lot of investment put on that land, a lot of development of the land, preparing it for farming. It could have tested some areas in farming. So there's a lot of areas you pick up there. You know, the second person's come in and has tried to do the business, but they still haven't got the cash flow right. And it is a business failure. It's a business risk when the business plan can be flawed because of the financing. And you know, there is two things here, is that when do you start generating cash from an agricultural business, and when do you come cash flow positive? I mean, Ramesh has said there, we could be talking 9 years. I mean, that's a long haul to take your investors with you. And I think that's a very, very important thing to consider when it comes to agriculture. So what I would like to do now is, we've got about 15, 20 minutes, and I'd like to basically ask anyone here, you know, let's get involved, let's dialogue. So any immediate questions from what you heard from myself and Ramesh in this first session? You know, we're trying to be open, please. Russell?
It's really a question to private sector, Ramesh, and then also now Chris yourself in multilaterals. Have you had any engagement with the likes of the BRICS Bank, or even for that matter, individual BRICS countries? And the reason why I'm asking that question is, call it what you want, but there is a bit of a pivot to the east in public sector thinking, and how that, you know, what they listen to and what they don't listen to. And so if there is an additional messenger in that advocation with government, particularly around the land issues, whether it's scary expropriation without compensation, or whether it's around maximizing the current public sector land holdings and trust holdings. So have you had had any engagement with BRICS Bank or BRICS countries, and is there a way to try and bring them into this discussion so that it's well received?
No engagement with the BRICS Bank, but I'll be honest and not polite. Working in the BRIC countries, we work in Brazil, we work in Russia, we work in India, we work in China. I also work in South Africa. Doing business in the BRICS countries is the most difficult. In the developed countries like the US, the rules are clear, private sector is independent, do what you want to do, right? As long as you play within the rules. In the developing countries, governments are engaged, communities are engaged, you can have a dialogue with everybody and work out a model that works for everybody. The BRIC countries believe they know everything, they don't want you there. We have enough self-grown industry and we are happy. So India is the same, China is the same, Russia is the same, Brazil is the same. South Africa is not very different. So that's my take on that.
I'll just add there, I'm doing an interesting piece of work at the moment related to Russia. There's been a lot of interest in the way the Russian government has promoted large-scale agricultural investment, and the bank has been doing some review on the request of the government of Russia on what impact a lot of that large-scale investment has had in terms of technology transfer and developing the agricultural sector, what impact it has in terms of volume. And what's been fascinating about that research is that a lot of those large-scale investments, which have received immense subsidies from the government, immense subsidies in inputs, access to foreign exchange, market preference, logistics, and a lot of subsidies through state or government-run banks. And the research will become public soon, but I can disclose that what was interesting for us as doing that was that you could see that those large-scale investments are really ring-fenced within the country. And if you look at their output has had minimal effect in terms of what it's brought into the marketplace, the local domestic marketplace, which the government was expecting a lot of that support to happen. And this is very true in quite a lot of the meat industry within that area. We were studying things like pork and so on, which has got large-scale pork and a lot of small-scale pork. And small-scale pork still got much more prevalence in the market than large-scale. So I think your question is really interesting on how it works, because Russia is very confused on its agricultural policy. Brazil, there's been a lot of mixed messages on how land and assets are being managed. There's been a lot of take-back in Brazil and restructuring going on. So when we, in the bank, we try and look at lessons learned to take from one area to another, we've got to be very picky on what lessons we look for and what recommendations we give to government. But I actually really strongly agree with Ramesh where those countries we're talking about, there's been a lot of challenges, and China is very difficult for foreign companies to actually perform in the environment. So it is very, very challenging. So that's a great question. And Meiko, you had a question?
Yes. Thank you very much for your speech, which is really interesting, and I think it motivates us to discuss about this topic. Ethiopia, I totally agree with you. IFC has been financing coffee farmers since 2008. We are going through a really difficult time. But then my question is about your financing aspect that you mentioned about sales and leaseback. For example, IFC, we are financing coffee farmers in Ethiopia, but this is to finance a washing station. So our which own the washing station to wash the red trays.
Right.
But then you are financing leaseback, which means that do you finance equipment? If it is the case, how do you finance those equipment? Is it a long-term financing? The other question is that in Ethiopia, we have to finance working capital as well, because this is what the cooperative union needs. So it's more like a combination of the more like leaseback or the washing station, and as well as the working capital. And the working capital is always a big program for many countries you mentioned, like Tanzania, Mozambique, Zambia. So how do you finance those farmers? Is it a combination of working capital and equipment finance, or thank you.
So I'll answer your question. I'll split it up first. The sale and leaseback I was talking about is how we, as investors, can use financial institutions to offload some of the funds that get blocked because you are in it for a long run. So that's not what I do. What we do is pre-finance working capital and pre-finance equipment purchase. Many times pre-finance small and medium enterprises who are trying to put up a processing center to support what we do. So very quick example, in Tanzania we used to have the world's largest cashew processing plant, employing over 7,000 people. But after 4 years of running it and training people, we put up 5 SMEs who who employed around 1,000 each, and different stages of the processing was then offloaded to them. So we would pre-finance the raw crop. The raw crop would come to the factory number 1, who do part of the process, give it to factory number 2, 3, 4. And eventually the product would come back to us for quality check, hand picking, and all the other technicalities. But the fact is, in the bargain, the industry sets up 5 different SMEs who we have pre-financed, who we continue to pre-finance because the raw material is still financed by us. That is the nature of our financing. So like I said earlier, we have about $200 million in pre-financing stuck at any point in time across Africa. That is not the sale and lease back.
There's quite a few questions. I'll just take from John.
Thank you, Ramesh, and I enjoyed your presentation, and we can obviously identify with a lot. Many South African agribusinesses, as you know, have ventured into Africa, with all due respect, with mixed results. And these have been in the media. And we've also had a session at IFAMA, the International Food and Agribusiness Management Association, meeting about 2 weeks ago in Miami. It's actually where I met Chris
Last year.
in IFAMA in Denmark last year. And you know, Olam is very involved. Raj was
Raj
there,
is
and we
there.
had a lot of discussions on many of the issues also around Africa. We had an Africa session looking at turning around the food import bill, as we called it, which is actually your food, your import substitution factor, which we strongly agree with. Your business model is more focused on the cash crops, or the crops that are specific to Africa nearly, I would say, specifically like coffee, cocoa, and so on. But if you look at the big import bill into Africa, and where Africa's food security is vulnerable, and Africa's food security is extremely vulnerable, is more around your cereal crops, etc. And this is where we battle to compete with the US, Brazil, Argentina, etc., to get those cash flows to make it a viable venture. Also, what we really battle with in Africa is governments interfering in the market mechanisms, especially around those crops, because they are deemed food security imperatives. And then you get import bans or export bans, you get contracts being rescinded, you don't get repatriation of money through the central banks where you do make a profit. There are various interventions by government which make business extremely difficult in Africa, especially in the SADC area where we've been involved in. And there are many here that have had direct experience of that. Now this remains a huge risk to that type of business, where we more want to go into other crops which we battle to be competitive. What is your take on that? And then the second question I have...
You got a second one. That was a
Yes,
long one. You
But that is fundamental to making agribusiness investments in Africa work. The second one is on more on the outgrower situation. It's one that Raj raised, and it's a big problem in South Africa too, is microfinance for outgrowers. It is so. Interest rates from banking or the more commercial mainstream financing institutions, 30%, 25-30% interest rates. Nobody's really going to get a return on that, especially if you're going into those type of crops that I was talking of, where your margins are thin. What is your take on microfinancing into Africa, and how do we approach this? Perhaps with IFC, World Bank sitting here, I think that is probably one of our biggest challenges on the continent.
Do you want to say a few words? I will answer some of your question actually in another session we're doing, okay? So don't be too put out.
On the first point, just to put some numbers to it, approximately $40 billion worth of agricultural commodities are imported into all of Africa. 32 billion out of that come from the big 5: rice, maize, wheat, dairy, and edible oil and sugar, right? So if we can resolve that, it's already a big part of the import bill that is substituted. The issue there, like you rightly said, is the fact that these are the 5 crops where the government interventions are the highest, and many times erratic, right? We have invested in rice farming, we have invested in sugar, and the largest sugar investors are sitting right here, so we'll talk to them as well, and to see what they think about government intervention as far as sugar is concerned. Edible oil is a big area of play for us. We have Africa's largest edible oil plantation coming up in Gabon, and we can supply a large part of CIMAC on account of that. So we are addressing the need of the big 5 already, is our view. It will take time, and it will take immense amount of negotiation with the government to be able to get a level playing field, to be able to operate that sensibly, is our view. Governments don't like partners in food security, is our experience, because they want complete control over that, a bit like education. much as there's a challenge, there is a need, and their execution is poor, they want complete control over it. Then we as private sector have little role to play, unless we put up farms like we are doing and show them that it is possible for us to address it. We can't solve Africa's food security problem, but we can, as one of the maybe 50 companies together, can make an effort. But somebody has to start.
I'll talk more about your outgrow question later on today, but just to let you know that there is a lot of movement, particularly in West Africa, in terms of rice. You know, West Africa is really well known for the amount of rice that flows out of Asia into West Africa. So we're actually commissioning work at the moment within the bank at the request of ECOWAS on looking at really how do we not just increase productivity, but how there can be standard policies across the ECOWAS region on rice. What does that mean? It's about import duty. There's differences of duties across those countries, and we are seeing, quite bluntly, rice going into one country and slipping across the border into another one. And the government see this as a huge problem. And rice, for me, tends to be the most political crop. And why do I say that? Because there's nowhere near enough being produced in these countries. And if there's a scarcity of rice, it hits the government in the urban centres. The urban centre is where rice is consumed. So therefore, the big challenge comes on how do you keep feeding those growing urban centres? How do you link the national market better to the urban centre and be less dependent? And the biggest fear when it comes to rice is that you've always got to look at this big number. You know, we think of rice as a big global crop, but very, very small amount of rice is internationally traded, about 4%. So we're dependent in West Africa on rice from Thailand and India and so on, which are smallholder crops, where that smallholder crop can be quite low one year, so the market price goes up, there could be scarcity, and that scarcity in India or scarcity in Thailand will result in political conflict in Lagos. We saw a big political meltdown in Cameroon in 2009 when the price of rice doubled in that area. So the politics are there, and I get really angry when governments have very knee-jerk reactions with policy. You know, you're setting up an investment and they're changing those policies. And that's where the bank has got its job role. You've got to look at us in really making sure that we're communicating and working on those policy dialogues as well. Okay? Sorry, there's more questions. There'll be a lot of, we have to be careful, of course, on our time. There is all day, remember. Ramesh with us for a while, so grab him in the coffee room. We'll just do one here, then we'll go over to yourself over there.
Back
Okay?
to your sale and leaseback discussion. I'm curious, I would have presumed that most of your land is leased land, and what sort of land models work for this kind of sale and leaseback?
No.
We're in the forestry business, so most of what we have is leased or concession.
So our experience with sale and leaseback in Africa is limited because the financial institutions are still getting used to it, but it has started. When you own the land, the banks feel the most comfortable with the SLB. When it is leased, then it depends on the government that they're dealing with, right? So in some governments' case, they are comfortable, in some they are not. So one has to be careful about what land model you bring back. No concession is acceptable for sale and leaseback. Either you must have ownership, that's the best, or you must have a long-term, like 99-year lease, then that works. But a concession doesn't work.
And have you had actual examples where it's worked, or it's
We are talking on the lease basis. We have a 99-year lease that we are talking to a bank with. They have no problem with the land.
on leaseback discussion? I'm curious, I would have presumed that most of your land is leased land, and what sort of land models work for this kind of sale and leaseback?
No.
We're in the forestry business, so most of what we have is leased or concession.
So our experience with sale and leaseback in Africa is limited because the financial institutions are still getting used to it, but it has started. When you own the land, the banks feel the most comfortable with the SLB. When it is leased, then it depends on the government that they're dealing with, right? So in some governments' case, they are comfortable, in some they are not. So one has to be careful about what land model you bring back. No concession is acceptable for sale and leaseback. Either you must have ownership, that's the best, or you must have a long-term, like 99-year lease, then that works. But a concession doesn't work.
And have you had actual examples where it's worked, or it's
We are talking on the lease basis. We have a 99-year lease that we are talking to a bank with. They have no problem with the land. They're trying to understand the model, and the size of the farm is not apparently good enough, so we are trying to expand that to make it interesting for the bank to be involved. With assets, plant and machinery, it's very simple.
A question over there? We've got about 5 more minutes.
must add my voice to thank you for the two introductions. I think there are so many issues on the table, and we're probably going to, in the live stream, going to tackle many of them. There's a fundamental issue for me, Ramesh, which you've addressed. You said there's simply not enough evidence for a workable Pan-African agricultural strategy. And the scenery in Africa, in terms of continental characteristics, is quite differing. When you work in southern Africa, it looks there's commercial agriculture that's been absolutely aided by the fact that there's very strong organized agricultural movements that simply does not exist above the equator, which means, and this is I'm leading up to the question now, that I think in a Pan-African strategy, there's too less emphasis placed on the formation of organized agricultural structures. What exists above the equator is actually NGOs running smallholders and people that's really caught in poverty traps, trying to just survive in the sort of small-scale farming that they're doing. And my question to you is that Olam is such a big global business. How much movement and what is your policy when you start identifying and working with smallholders? Is there a focus on taking a smallholder that shows signs of improvement to actually to take them to a level where they can become a proper medium and a bigger commercial farmer, one? And secondly, what's your policy in supporting the formation of study groups, organized agricultural structures? Because I'm really convinced if the two meet one another, we will get much more of a foundation to work more sensibly and to get to all corners of our continent.
Okay. So USAID called us Africa's largest microfinanciers with no collaterals, right? That's why I said we have $200 billion at any point in time with 2.5 million farmers with no collaterals, okay? That is a first step in the support that we provide these farmers. It's in our interest if the farmers have larger lands that they can control and work on. And as you know, in southern Africa, that's very easy because there's plenty of land, not enough farmers. The last study in Zambia was that one farmer in 2 square kilometers is the approximate land density in the farming areas. So, and you know that one farmer cannot farm 2 square kilometers, it's not possible. So at 2 hectares, we are quite happy to get the farmer and his family to contribute in the farm. Our job is to ensure that they're educated on agricultural practices. We try and bring as good seed as possible, and you know that many governments don't like new breed seed. In Zimbabwe, for example, we're running a 30th generation cotton seed and trying to produce cotton and trying to get it to world output. It's not possible. So you have to battle those. Inputs in many countries are not subsidized, so the farmer has to pay a high price or I have to pay a high price. What we can do is set up model farms, show them good practices, and get the best possible out of the given seed, out of the given cost of inputs, and the best agronomical practices. You know that it's not possible financially to irrigate all of this and make the agriculture weatherproof. Where there are corporate farms, we do irrigation to try and ensure that the output is at least steady and controlled. Where it's not, then you have to depend a bit on the drought and the weather and the rain. But in these conditions, the best that is possible for the farmer is to show them what the best practices are through continuous education. So the cotton farms I talked about in Mozambique, it's a 7-year process where the farmers are going through the same process thrice a year to learn how to make how to put in better practices to get better yields. And slowly, the yields are getting better. In the Ivory Coast, on the other hand, where there is an old culture of growing cotton, we have an 80,000 hectare farm with over 160,000 farmers working there on their own farms. There, the yields are almost a ton. And that's because it's, again, 8-9 years of repeated practice, better seed because the government is willing to support that, and we are willing to put in inputs and subsidize the farmer. So, different models for different parts. But in the end, it's a lot of grunt work.
I think what we'll round off now for a break. But I think what's really interesting there, the work here is public-private partnership. The bank has to get much more involved in not just in the policy setting, but supporting the government agenda to enable smallholders to work better with companies or the private sector to bring their product to market. So you know, this role that I said in my few words about the public-private partnership concept. When Ramesh is talking there, I'm thinking, you know, you just do all my job, then I'm fine, you know, because, you know, you're getting very much into the public space. But it is not economic for a lot of companies to actually do all of this work. Let's face it, the smallholder will remain disconnected until the public sector does stronger work in terms of support. And it goes back to the cash crop, food crop. that's something we can discuss as we go through the day in our sessions. So basically, just to close this piece now, we are just going to ask you to bear with us, because we're going to split into 2 rooms after the coffee tea break. And we've got our names up here on who's going to go to room number 2. Is this one. So these group of people, we're going to come back and sit on these front tables. And the people not there, these guys, will go on the other side. Okay? Is that okay, everybody? Does everyone catch that? And obviously, the subjects we're talking about, these knowledge notes, we want to keep it towards the subject, but the subjects are quite cross-cutting as well. And there's, as I said, there's plenty of time for debate as well. Okay? Thank you very much. Thank you.